Autumn of 1887. Wyoming lay wide and gold, the grass on the slopes turning brittle under a sky clear yet carrying the edge of coming frost. In the town of Redemption Creek, a strange restlessness hummed. Folks crowded the main street, pressing toward the meeting hall as if waiting on a show. But all knew there would be no music, no festival, only a spectacle both curious and cruel, the widow auction. That practice, if one could call it tradition, was an unspoken law of the frontier. A woman left without her husband, stripped of her household's anchor, was brought up for public bidding. The winner claimed the right to take her home as a wife, in return granting her shelter under his roof. For some it was chance at survival, for others nothing more than trade in human fate. Among the crowd that day sat a figure astride a tall horse, Caleb Morgan. He owned the Double C Ranch, 40 years of age, broad-shouldered, square-built, with a dark hide coat drawn across his frame. Caleb rarely showed his face where noise gathered. They said he was rich, his land stretching clear to the river's bend, but that he lived behind fences and horses, a quiet man shadowed by his own silence. He had once gone to war, they whispered, and returned with ash-gray eyes carrying things he never spoke. He had no intent to linger. He despised the sight of women forced onto a platform like stock. But as he turned to ride on, a murmur caught his ear and pulled his gaze back toward the wooden stage. 4 women stepped out. 3 were known: the blacksmith's widow, the carter's wife, the woman left by a trapper dead last winter. The last, she drew the air from every throat: Jemima Jackson. Her name rang from the caller, but it was her presence that stilled the crowd. Black-skinned, straight but slender, wrapped in a black shawl falling from crown to shoulder. A veil hung low, soft and shadowed, hiding her face. None knew what lay beneath. The whispers rose at once. Why does she hide so? They say her face is marked, or carrying sickness. Laughter cracked sharp, disbelief running bitter through the line. Jemima did not flinch. Her hands clasped at her breast, trembling faint, yet her stance was upright, almost defiant. Only her eyes, dark clear behind the gauze, spoke of breath, of will still unbroken. Caleb's reins tightened in his grip. He had seen many eyes, the glaze of a soldier at his last breath, the panic of a horse trapped in a canyon, the hunger of a woman begging bread. This was different. It struck his chest clean through. From the crowd came a voice, loud, grating with mirth. "Well, well, Caleb Morgan." It was Buck Watson, owner of the horse ranch over the ridge. Shorter in stature but brash in every word, Buck had long carried a thorn for Caleb, for his wealth, for his calm, for all he would not bend to. "You came out too, did you? Just to watch men take their wives? That woman there, Jemima, is it? She suits you well. Enough. You got the grit to bid? Or you scared of what foul thing hides under that veil?" The crowd broke in laughter, whistles sharp in the cold air. Caleb's eyes held steady on Buck, gray and flat as tempered steel. He was not one for taunts, yet the noise and the woman's gaze seemed to root him to the earth. Jemima turned her face. For a breath, her eyes cut through the veil and locked on his. A moment only, yet it struck him still as stone. In them was despair, yes, but fire too. A wordless plea. "See me as I am." Caleb drew a slow breath, his fingers tightening on the leather reins. The street hushed. Buck Watson smirked, waiting for him to speak, and Jemima, eyes fixed unbroken, stood as a silent dare. The hall was strung tight as a bowstring. After Buck Watson's taunt, every eye fixed on Caleb Morgan. He sat straight in the saddle, ash-gray gaze trained on the wooden platform. He had never meant to take part, yet the look that cut through Jemima Jackson's veil held him rooted. "Well then, Double C," Buck called again, voice dripping scorn. "What's the matter? Rich as you are, still too much a coward to reach for the mystery under that cloth?" The crowd broke into laughter, whistles sharp, heads shaking. The noise pressed in heavy, thickening the air. Caleb held steady, though something stirred within. Since war, he had learned to let mockery pass over him like wind. But Jemima's eyes, pleading and proud all at once, waited for his answer. The caller struck the table with his hammer. $10. Who'll give me 10? A drunken voice rang out. 10. I'll pay 10. Laughter followed, rough and hollow. 15, shouted another from the back. The bidding crawled upward, half-hearted, stripped of eagerness. No man wished to spend hard coin on a woman hiding her face. Whispers cut through. What if she's hideous? What if she carries disease? Buck turned with a booming laugh. Come now, Morgan. Why sit so quiet? Start us off proper. Caleb's hand tightened on the reins. He lifted his chin, his voice clear, low, steady. 50. The hall fell still, then broke in murmurs. None had expected him to speak. Buck's eyes narrowed, mouth twisting. 70. Caleb's face did not move. 100. Gasps swept the room. $100. A sum that could buy a wagon team, or land enough to feed a family. The caller glanced around, waiting. Buck's jaw worked, his voice rough. 150. The air coiled thick in every chest. All knew these two men bore old grievance, and now the auction had turned into a duel. Caleb sat tall, eyes locked on Jemima. He saw her shoulders twitch beneath the shawl. He could not tell if it was fear or fury, but his heart struck harder in his ribs. His voice rang out, firm. 200! Silence crashed over the hall. Even Buck fell dumb, face flushing with rage. $200. The caller's hammer struck. Sold! Jemima Jackson to Mr. Caleb Morgan. Her name rang clear, for the first time spoken plain before them all. Jemima Jackson. The room stirred again, mocking laughs, sighs, wide-eyed shock. Caleb paid them no mind. He strode to the stage, his broad hand reaching upward. Jemima faltered. A breath of pause, the whole crowd holding still. Then slowly, she laid her hand in his. Caleb stilled, startled. Her hand was soft, too soft for toil, too fine for hardship. No callus, no scar, delicate, almost refined. Yet it trembled, each quiver beating against his palm. He closed his grip, firm, steady. He meant only to guide her down, but held longer than needful. In that moment, Jemima lifted her gaze. Through the thin veil, her eyes met his once more. There were no words, only a crossing of shadow and light. He could not know if her tremor was fear of chains or the strain of some hidden truth. But he knew this: those eyes belonged to no weak soul. Step by step, he led her down. The town's stares clung to them. Some sneered, some whispered. Buck Watson stood off, red-faced, fists clenched white. Caleb guided her to the ground, her hand still resting in his. Each stare brought the tremor of her fingers against his hold. When her feet touched earth, He released slow, letting his fingertips graze her skin before parting. Jemima lowered her gaze, veil falling once more. For an instant, Caleb caught the press of her lips, tight, as if sealing in a long-suffered wait. He could not yet tell where this forced union might lead, but one thing in him had shifted, sure as the strike of iron on anvil. That evening, clouds pressed low, the sunset spilling fire across the ridges, turning Redemption Creek into a valley of shadow and flame. Caleb Morgan rode tall in the saddle, reins steady in his hand, while beside him Jemima Jackson walked in silence. She still wore the heavy black shawl, her face veiled. No word passed between them on the long road out of town. Only the rhythm of hooves, the whisper of wind through brittle grass, and the distant cry of crows broke the stillness. Caleb glanced toward her, noting how her shoulders stayed straight, though they quivered under the chill gusts. He thought to speak, but her eyes, dark depths behind the gauze, kept him silent. The Double C Ranch rose ahead on the horizon, fences stretching wide, horses running free across pasture, the main house standing firm among aspen trees. In the yard, Maria, the old housekeeper, stiffened at the sight of the veiled woman. She gave a respectful nod, asked no question, and stepped aside. Caleb led Jemima down the hall of pine and hearth smoke, stopping at a door at the end. He opened it, lamplight spilling across the floor. "This will be your room," he said quietly. "I'll force nothing on you. When you're ready, you can lay the veil aside." She gave a faint nod, entered, and closed the door. Night settled deep. The ranch lay hushed under the wind's long cry. In his study, Caleb sat with a half-full glass of whiskey, untouched. His mind lingered on the woman he had brought home from town, her silence weighing heavier than any words. Near midnight, a soft knock stirred him. He set the glass aside, rose and opened the door. Jemima stood there, still cloaked head to foot. She paused at the threshold, her voice low, deliberate though trembling. "Mr. Morgan, may I sit a while?" He nodded, pulling out the chair opposite his desk. She sat with a straight back, hands folded neat in her lap. The lamplight flickered, the only sound the hiss of oil. Then she lifted her gaze, eyes dark behind the veil. "Why?" she asked slowly. "Why spend such money on me? You've no need of a stranger, least of all one cloaked in rumor." Caleb leaned an arm on the desk, meeting the shrouded figure. "Pride, maybe. Buck Watson taunted me, and I'd not stomach his sneer before the town. But," he hesitated, eyes lowering, "not that alone. When you stood there, I saw something different, a kind of pride. I couldn't leave you to be mocked like that." Her hands tightened under the shawl. After a long pause, she asked again, "You are not afraid? That behind this veil is a face ruined, scarred, twisted, enough to make men recoil?" Caleb's brow lifted slightly. His answer came without pause. "No. I've seen worse on this land. Men without legs, faces burned raw, hands split and missing. A face doesn't measure a soul. I didn't pay for beauty. I paid so you wouldn't stand alone before wolves." The air grew heavy. Jemima's voice softened, and curiosity. "You've none at all, for what I truly am under here." He drew a breath, about to speak, but before he could, her slender fingers rose. One by one she loosened the folds. Black cloth slipped like smoke to the floor. The lamplight struck her face, and Caleb stilled. No scars, no disfigurement. Instead, a beauty so sharp it seemed unreal. Velvet dark skin, eyes glimmering deep as still water, high sculpted cheekbones, full curved lips. It was a face that hushed the room, even with no audience. Jemima's smile was bitter, her eyes wet with unshed fire. See? No scars, only beauty. And it is beauty that has cursed me. Caleb leaned back, not recoiling but stricken by the weight of it. She spoke on, voice even as if reciting her own sentence. While my husband lived, I was his wife, sheltered, respected. But after the mind took him, the eyes of men changed. They saw not a woman, but a prize. By day they came with sweet words. By night they threw stones at my window, made threats. One tried to force his way inside. I sat with a knife in my hands till dawn. Other women, plain, poor, worn, they were scorned but left in peace. Me? This face made me quarry. So I veiled it, buried myself in shadow. Yet it changed nothing. The hunger still followed. Still would not let me be, her eyes shone, proud despite the sting of tears. Caleb felt a heaviness rise in his chest, an ache for her solitude, her hunger for a life lived plain, not hunted, not turned into spoil. The silence stretched long. Then, moved by a force he did not name, he said quietly, "Now you're here. None will touch you, unless through me." She started, her gaze catching his. Their eyes held, wordless, binding tighter than oath. The first night at Double C Ranch held no taking, no demand. Only a face unveiled, a secret laid bare, and a wound spoken aloud. Caleb knew then he could not look upon Jemima Jackson as a woman to be sheltered out of duty, but as a soul both radiant and burdened, whom he could no longer turn away from. Autumn in Wyoming softened after the howling winds. At Double C Ranch, life carried its steady rhythm, the ring of hammer on horseshoe, the lowing of cattle from the valley, the drift of kitchen smoke rising from Maria's stove. Yet something new threaded itself into that routine, the presence of Jemima Jackson. At first, she kept to her room, stepping out only when needed, her black veil still wrapped tight so that all gave her distance. Maria, seasoned by years of keeping house, asked no questions. Instead, she pressed small tasks into Jemima's hands, sorting beans, rinsing rice, setting the kitchen in order. They were invitations, not demands, giving her a chance to feel useful again. One morning, Jemima followed Maria out back. There lay a patch of ground once a vegetable garden, now overrun with weeds. Maria shook her head. "Soil's worn out. I've tried more than once. Nothing will grow." Jemima crouched, sleeves rolled, her slender fingers sifting through cracked earth. The dust smelled dry and bitter, but she did not recoil. Instead, a faint smile touched her lips, the first since she'd arrived. "Every soil can breathe," she murmured, "if someone has patience." Maria studied her strangely, then shrugged. "If you care to try, it's yours." From that day, Jemima came each morning. She cleared weeds, turned earth, dug narrow channels for water. Her hands, once made for pen and paper, grew rough under sun, yet her movements were steady, meticulous. Ranch hands, men used to rope and saddle, not spade and hoe, watched from a distance at first, their laughter edged with mockery. "So the mysterious lady fancies herself a gardener," one muttered. But when green shoots began to pierce the soil, when tomatoes and squash took root, the jeers faded. They found themselves carrying water buckets, hauling soil at her side. Maria noticed Jemima still kept the veil when she worked. But one golden morning, sweat streaked her temple, and she slipped the cloth free. For the first time, her face was revealed under open day. Sunlight traced her features, warm brown skin, eyes deep and alight, the faintest curve of a smile. The ranch hands froze, struck dumb. They had not imagined such beauty beneath the shawl, beauty that stilled rather than provoked. None dared speak crude. Their looks shifted, careful, even reverent. A young hand, Pete, plucked a wildflower from the fence and clumsily offered it. Jemima smiled, her voice gentle. "Thank you, Pete. It's lovely." His cheeks flamed red. He fled toward the stables, leaving the others in silence, respect plain in their eyes. From the porch, Caleb Morgan watched. He leaned against a post, gray eyes fixed on her figure in the sun. He saw Pete's clumsy gift, saw the altered gazes of the men. Something stirred. Jealousy. Faint, but undeniable. Jemima glanced up. Their eyes met across the yard, held for a heartbeat too long, then broke away. Caleb turned, fussing with a mong, horse's tether. Jemima bent again to her beans, water streaming from the dipper. Yet both felt the undercurrent, nameless, disquieting. Maria stepped onto the porch with a basket of greens. She caught Caleb's gaze, caught his lingering attention, and smiled faintly, the knowing smile of one who had lived long and seen much. Days passed, and the garden thrived. Jemima was no longer a veiled shadow drifting through halls, but a thread in the ranch's fabric. She discussed compost with Maria, taught Pete to prune wilted leaves, listened as the hands shared stories of past winters. Each small act, each quiet smile, stitched trust back into lives worn thin by hardship. Caleb took it all in. He said little, offered no command. Yet at night, when he sat alone on the porch, he recalled Jemima's eyes in the sunlight, eyes once heavy with sorrow, now touched with moments of peace. That memory left him both eased and uneasy, as though some part of him had been altered without his consent. The first winter sun fell sharp on the Wyoming plains, dry and searing, though the air carried chill. Work at Double C Ranch never paused, and that morning the men were hauling sacks of grain into the storehouse. Pete, eager as always, hoisted one heavy bag on his shoulder with a grin. The grin vanished when a scream tore from inside. Pete dropped the sack, his face gone white. "Snake!" "There's a rattler in the grain." The ranch hands stumbled back, fear etched in their eyes. In Wyoming, rattlesnakes were no strangers, but facing one meant death quick as a bullet. From the straw heap came the hiss and rattle of its tail, metal on metal, chilling as a blade drawn slow. They stood frozen, none daring to step closer. Caleb had just left the stables when Jemima appeared in the doorway. She wore only a simple work dress, her hair knotted high, her face unveiled. "Step back," she said. Her voice was calm, low, but steady enough to cut through the panic. She strode inside, black eyes fixed, scanning the shadows. Her hand closed around a wooden handle propped against the wall. She twirled it lightly once. The snake coiled, head raised, tongue flicking. The tail rattled harder, warning sharp as gunfire. For a breath, the air locked still. Then Jemima lunged. The staff cracked down just behind the serpent's head. It writhed and lashed, but she struck again, swift and certain. The thud echoed off timber. The snake sagged, limp, lifeless. Silence followed. The men gaped, mouths open. Pete stammered, "Lord above, she—" Maria was first to speak, her voice hushed. "I've never seen hands that steady." Caleb stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Jemima. He had thought her fragile, needing guard. But here she stood, a woman alone against venom, her movements firm, fearless. His chest gave a beat he could not name. Jemima let the staff fall. Only then did her hand tremble, releasing. Caleb saw it, the small scrape across her skin, blood beading. He crossed to her quick, catching her hand. "You're hurt." She froze. His hand was large, warm, enclosing hers. He bent over the wound, his thumb brushing gently along her palm. It was but a scratch, yet his focus was fierce as if her life hung on it. "It's nothing." She began to pull away, but he held firm. From his pocket he drew a kerchief, wiping the blood with slow, careful strokes. She sat still, caught by the quiet insistence of his touch. The room shrank around them, whispers dimming to nothing. Jemima's gaze wavered, unsettled. Caleb knew he held too long, but let go only when her breath shifted. She withdrew at last, voice soft as a sigh. "Thank you." He met her eyes, nodding slow. From that day, the ranch hands looked at Jemima differently. No longer the veiled lady or the hidden beauty. She became one of them, respected, Pete most of all. The boy shadowed her steps, eager in every chore. When she bent in the garden, he brought water. When she worked in the kitchen, he carried wood. Sometimes clumsy excuses were enough. "Let me lend a hand." And Jemima, seldom given to laughter, began to smile at his fumbling tales of calves gone astray, or the pratfalls of his work. Her laughter rang clear, a sound foreign to the ranch, sweeter than wind through grass. From the porch, Caleb watched. He saw Pete offer a wildflower, saw Jemima tilt her head, the faintest smile bright under the sun. Each time something tightened in him, sharp as wire. He did not blame her. She had a right to smile, to feel joy after years of shadow. Yet the stirring inside him was unmistakable. Jealousy. A feeling he thought buried with his soldier's past, now clawed back to life. Caleb stood in the shade, eyes fixed too long, then turned away, quick. He would not let them see the storm in him. But in the marrow of his bones he knew, since Jemima had crossed his threshold, nothing remained as it had been, and the change he could not master. That evening, Caleb Morgan chose to take Jemima riding across the range. Their horses walked side by side along the dirt road that cut into the prairie. The sky was awash in pale violet. Threads of cloud stretched thin like spun silk. Caleb said little, yet Jemima felt his gaze drift toward her often, steady and searching. At first, the talk was simple. Horses, cattle, the work of winter. But before long, the words turned deeper. Jemima spoke of her childhood with her mother, of evenings filled with hymns that lingered like prayer. Caleb spoke of the war, of comrades lost, of holes in memory that never healed. Wounds once buried opened easily under the wide wind, and in their telling, both found kinship in pain. On the way back, they met Ned Bartlett, a coarse man known for his foul tongue. He reined in his horse, his small eyes crawling over Jemima, his voice a sneer. "So, Morgan bows after all, brought down by a pretty face, even if it sits on black skin." The words dropped like lead. Caleb's jaw clenched. reins straining in his grip, his gray eyes flashing with anger. He was ready to leap down and answer with his fists, but Jemima's hand touched his arm, gentle yet firm. "Don't," she said. "He isn't worth it." Her gaze was calm, weary rather than furious. Caleb's breath came rough, but at last he gave a short nod. They rode on, leaving Bartlett behind in the dust. Night brought storm. Rain lashed the windows. Thunder shook the rafters. Lightning split the dark. In her room, Jemima sat by the bed, trembling at each gust that tore the curtains. Old memories crowded close. The knocks at her door, the threats shouted in the dark, the terror of waiting alone. A knock sounded now. She startled, then heard Caleb's voice outside, low and concerned. "Are you well, Jemima?" She opened the door. He stood damp from the storm, his eyes searching, guarded. "I'm fine," she whispered. He nodded. "Good. I just wanted to be sure." He hesitated. "If so, I'll leave you be." He turned for the door, hand on the latch. Then he stopped, not facing her fully, his voice rough beneath the rain. "Jemima, could you not smile at other men? That smile of yours, I'd keep it for myself." The words hung, raw, startling as thunder. Jemima's heart stumbled in her chest. Caleb sighed, pressing his palm to the door, ready to leave. But behind him, her voice rose, soft, trembling yet clear. "Caleb, will you stay with me tonight?" The door fell shut. He turned. Their eyes met, no space left between. Caleb stepped forward slowly, as if fearing the moment might shatter. He stood before her, their breath mingling with the storm. Jemima lifted her face, her eyes gleaming with lightning's flare. No more words were needed. His hand rose, brushing her cheek. Her skin was warm, trembling with fear and longing both. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch as though it were shelter. Then the last distance vanished. Their lips met, hesitant, then fierce like fire catching dry grass. Rain hammered the roof, but inside only breath and heartbeat filled the room. They moved to the bed, unhurried, step by step, as though both knew this was more than desire. Caleb's lips traced her shoulder, her hands, each touch a vow to erase the years she had been treated as less than human. Jemima trembled, then clung to him, for once reaching first for warmth. Lightning lit the room, their bodies entwined. No shame, no veil, no distance, only trust, yearning, and the solace of being seen. Jemima was no longer the woman hidden beneath black cloth. Caleb no longer the man locked away by silence. They were simply two souls, bare and unguarded, finding each other in the storm. Afterward they lay side by side, breath slowing. Rain still roared, thunder still cracked, yet within those walls, a peace took root. Caleb turned, his fingers brushing through her hair. He whispered, "From this night on, no one takes your smile from me." Jemima opened her eyes, holding his gaze. Then she smiled, a smile not for the world, not for the ranch hands or the town, but for him alone. That Wyoming morning was clear as glass. Winter sun poured over Redemption Creek, rare and sharp, setting the small town alight with noise and stir. For the first time since the widow's auction, Caleb Morgan brought Jemima down to town. She no longer hid beneath the black veil. She wore a simple dress of moss green, her hair drawn back to bare her face. When the two rode in side by side, The street seemed to still. Men stopped their work, stares unguarded, some with jaws slack, others whispering, God above. All this beauty, hidden all that time. Women looked on with envy sharpened by judgment. We'll see what trouble she brings Morgan yet, one murmured. Caleb paid them no heed. He sat steady in the saddle, his hand firm on the reins, his gray eyes straying now and again to Jemima. She rode upright, her black gaze fixed ahead, proud, unflinching. Yet he knew beneath that calm her heart raced, for this was the first time she had shown herself openly beneath the weight of every prying eye. In the crowd, one face darkened more than all others. Buck Watson. He leaned against the saloon post, cigarette slipping forgotten from his lips. When Jemima bared her face, Buck looked as though struck. Memory of the auction seared back, how he had laughed, how he had bid for sport, and how Caleb Morgan, the man he hated most, had carried away the prize. The burn of it twisted in him. Regret, jealousy, wounded pride. He shoved off the post and strode across the street, planting himself before horse and rider. Morgan, he spat, his eyes crawling over Jemima, hunger plain. So, what you brought home wasn't common stock after all. I'll admit it. I was blind that day. But now I see clear. I'm ready to pay a fairer price. Caleb's voice was iron. Step aside, Watson. Buck's lip curled, his words lowered so the crowd could not hear. 20 head. My best Morgan colts. I'll trade them for her. You'd make a fortune. The air thickened at once. Jemima stiffened, her breath caught. The crowd, though deaf to the words, felt the charge and leaned in, waiting. Caleb swung down from the saddle. His steps were slow, heavy, until he stood before Buck. Then his hand shot, gripping Buck's collar, jerking him near enough to taste his anger. Caleb's eyes blazed, his voice thundered. Never speak of her as trade. Jemima is no man's merchandise. Not yours, not anyone's. Say such again, and you'll carry the scar all your days. The street went dead quiet. Men shifted back, fearing the strike of violence. Buck squirmed, face flushed, but Caleb's grip was iron, unshakable. Then Caleb shoved him hard. Buck staggered, fell to the dirt. Caleb turned his back without pause. He reached up, lifted Jemima gently down, and led her past the staring crowd. Murmurs rose behind them, but none dared interfere. On the road home, Jemima sat close behind him, her hand resting light against his waist. She spoke no word, but her weight leaned to him, and he felt it. That choice, that trust. No pretense, no veil between them. Caleb bent his head, catching the faint scent of her hair carried on the wind. His heart slowed, heavy with warmth. In that moment, he knew Jemima no longer saw him as the rancher who bought her from an auction block. She leaned on him as a woman leans on her man. They rode on in silence, but it was no empty quiet. It brimmed, binding them tighter than any oath spoken aloud. That night, the sky held no moon. Wind whistled across the fields, and Double C Ranch lay in darkness, broken only by a lantern or two burning near the stables. Jemima was there, helping Maria bind the hay bales tight. Horses shifted and snorted, hooves tapping steady, the sort of sound so familiar no one thought to be wary. But at the far edge of the fence, a figure lurked. He moved low, eyes darting. A torch flared bright in his hand. He hurled it into the straw piled against the wall. In an instant the flames caught, wind carrying them upward, a red streak tearing through the dark. Fire! The stables are burning! The cry split the night. Ranch hands came running from the bunkhouse, faces pale as they saw the blaze climbing fast up the timber. Inside, horses screamed, eyes wild, slamming against their stalls in terror. "Jemima's still in there!" Maria shrieked, her face drained. Caleb heard from the yard. He didn't think twice. He tore off his coat and plunged straight into the smoke. Heat blasted him. Smoke clawed his eyes raw. He pressed his arm across his mouth and pushed forward. Through the haze, he heard coughing, weak but steady. Jemima knelt by a stall, struggling to wrench open the iron latch as a frantic horse kicked and reared. "Jemima!" Caleb roared, seizing her, yanking her back. He drove his shoulder into the gate. The latch snapped, and the horse bolted, nearly knocking them flat. Caleb wrapped an arm around Jemima, dragging her toward the door. But overhead, a burning beam gave way, crashing down across his arm, fire licking his sleeve. Pain tore through him. "Your arm!" Jemima gasped. "It's nothing!" he snarled, smothering the flames with a ragged twist of cloth. He gritted his teeth, hauling her out. Behind them, the roof thundered down, sparks leaping into the sky. Ranch hands surged forward, buckets of water flying, shouts ringing. Caleb stood with Jemima still in his arms, breath ragged, blood running from his scorched arm, too focused on her to notice. Meanwhile, Pete, who had long shadowed Jemima with boyish devotion, had chased the fleeing arsonist. The man cut for the fence line, thinking to vanish into the dark. But Pete was faster. He slammed him to the ground, the two grappling in the dust. Youth and fury won out. Pete bound him tight with rope and dragged him back toward the flames. He shoved the man into the yard, chest heaving. "Caught him!" He threw the torch. All eyes turned on the captive. Under their glare he broke, shaking, and spat the truth. "It wasn't me alone. Buck Watson paid me. Said burn the stables, make Morgan taste ruin." The yard erupted. Curses, rage, men shouting Buck's name like a curse. Everyone knew the grudge he bore since the auction, now laid bare in coward's fire. Caleb's breath was harsh, his sleeve blackened, but his gray eyes cut cold. "Tie him in the woodshed. At dawn he goes to the sheriff. And Watson, he'll answer for every filthy shoon." Deed the men obeyed, dragging the arsonist off. Pete lingered, eyes darting to Jemima. "Are you all right?" "I was afraid." "No." Jemima cut him gently, turning to Caleb. "He saved me." Pete faltered, his gaze sinking, and stepped aside. Later, when the flames were quenched and the yard still reeked of smoke, Caleb sat in the main room, his arm wrapped in rough bandages. Jemima sat close, her hands trembling as they brushed his skin. "You might have died," she whispered, her voice breaking. He gave a faint smile, calm despite the pain. "If I hadn't gone in, it would be you lost." She said nothing, only leaned her head to his shoulder. No veil, no distance, just a woman trembling for safety, and a man giving it without measure. Caleb breathed deep, catching the smoke scent tangled in her hair, yet beneath it the warmth of her. He tilted his cheek to rest against her crown, and in that moment he knew. Buck Watson might burn barns, might send men to sabotage, but he would never lay a hand on this, on the trust Jemima had placed in him. Outside, the wind moaned over the embers still glowing. But in that small room, two lives sat pressed together, needing no words to know their fates were bound as one. That morning, Redemption Creek stirred like a hive. The church bell tolled long and heavy, calling folk to gather at the small courthouse on Main Street. Word had flown fast. Caleb Morgan and his ranch hands were bringing the arsonist to trial, and with him the name of Buck Watson. Inside the paneled room of rough-hewn timber, every bench was filled. Voices hummed, eager for the fall of a man who had stirred enmity for years. Caleb sat in the front row, his arm still bound in bandages, Jemima close at his side, her face calm, her eyes bright with fire. Behind them stood Pete and the ranch hands, a wall of strength. The arsonist was dragged in, wrists tied, his head bent low. Minutes later, Buck Watson entered, slicked hair, gray coat, his swagger worn thin. His eyes darted, no longer bold. The old judge struck his gavel, voice ringing. This court hears the charge of arson at Double C Ranch. Samuel Briggs is named as the hand who lit the fire, but testimony claims Buck Watson paid him. We will hear the proof Samuel Briggs was shoved to the center. Under the weight of every stare, his words stumbled out. I only did what Buck Watson told me. He gave me money, told me to burn Morgan's stables. I didn't mean no harm, just followed orders. Buck shot to his feet. Lies. He smears my name. I had no part in this. The crowd rustled, some nodding, some shaking their heads. Caleb rose, laying a packet on the judge's desk. His voice carried steady. Here is the proof. We found the purse of coins in Briggs's house, each marked with the stamp Buck Watson uses on every wage he pays. Look close. The judge lifted the paper wrapping. In the light, plain as day, the hoof and W brand stood clear on the silver. A gasp swept the room. All eyes turned to Buck. His face blanched, then flushed. It's forged. Money is money. Marks mean nothing. But a ranch hand from Double C stepped forward. I worked for Buck once. My pay came stamped the same, week after week. It can't be mistaken. Another voice rose from the crowd. I seen it too. Delivered horses, paid with those coins. Everyone knows his mark. Buck faltered, his eyes wild, searching. The gavel fell, sharp. Silence. The court finds Samuel Briggs guilty of arson. He will serve his sentence. Buck Watson is judged guilty of conspiracy, ordered to pay damages to Double C Ranch, and barred from horse trade for 3 years. The room broke into clamor. Some shook their heads. At last, his mask torn. Others muttered, he thought himself untouchable. Now he pays. Buck's cry rang harsh. I'm framed. Morgan did this. You'll regret it, all of you. But no ear bent to him. Even his old allies turned aside, unwilling to share his fall. 2 deputies hauled him out, chains rattling, pride broken to dust. Jemima sat still, her hands knotted, then loosed with a long breath. Pete nudged Caleb, whispering, You've done it. Truth stands. Caleb gave a short nod. When he turned, he caught Jemima's eyes on him. Not gratitude alone, but trust. Deep, unshaken. When they left the courthouse, townsfolk drifted off, still whispering. Some spoke of Jemima's beauty, others of her courage in the fire. Yet all agreed. Caleb Morgan was more than land and horses. He was a man who would spend his blood to defend a woman's honor. On the steps, Jemima slowed. Then, before all eyes, she leaned her shoulder to his. Caleb stiffened, breath caught, then let it out, his hand settling gentle over hers. Under the blaze of the winter sun, before the whole of Redemption Creek, Jemima showed the world where her faith lay. That winter came late. Snow lay thin on the hills around Redemption Creek, the air sharp but not yet bitter. At Double C Ranch, the day broke with a different kind of stir. A pine arch was set at the gate. White ribbons ran the fence, and inside Maria and the ranch hands bustled, baking pies, warming cider, gathering flowers. Caleb Morgan said little, yet every detail bore his mark. He had ordered a wedding dress for Jemima, plain muslin, white as frost, edged with lace fine at the cuffs and hem. No finery, no grandeur, but in his eyes it was worthy of her, for this would be her first true bridal gown. Jemima had once been wed, but that day had been hurried, bare, in a small cabin with no flowers, no rings. Her husband poor, their witness only an old Bible on the table. Never had she dared to dream of walking an aisle in white, blessed before all. That morning Maria guided her to the mirror. Jemima stared, her throat tight, and tears broke free. Not the bitter kind she had known, but tears of astonishment that fate had turned at last to give her this chance. The wedding was held in the little church at town's center. Low rafters, sunlight streaming through stained glass in colored shafts across the floor. The pews were full, folk drawn not only by duty, but by curiosity. Yet this time, curiosity carried no scorn. Their gazes held something else: acknowledgement. Jemima Jackson, once bartered like stock, now walked proud in white. At the altar stood Caleb, tall and black, his shoulders filling the space. When the doors swung wide and Jemima stepped in, organ music rising, his breath caught. All he had ever thought of her, strong, proud, untouchable, melted into one truth. She was radiant, not for beauty alone, but for the quiet faith shining with every step. Nearer she came, and his hand reached. She set her smaller hand in his, and their eyes met. For a heartbeat, the church fell away, leaving only the two of them. The preacher spoke his blessing. Caleb and Jemima repeated the vows, steady, voices unshaken. At the exchange of rings, Caleb slid the silver band onto her finger. Then, instead of letting go, he lifted her hand and brushed his thumb to her cheek. A gesture plain, yet heavier than any oath. Jemima's tears fell then, but she smiled through them, her shoulders trembling. Caleb bent close, whispering low enough for her alone. "No shadow will touch you now." "Amen," rang the final word, and the preacher declared them man and wife. Applause burst, rolling like thunder, louder than the bells. The feast after was simple, held in the ranch yard. The men raised cups, sang old trail songs. Maria brought forth a rough white cake. Pete, with a smile that faltered, offered Jemima a bouquet of wildflowers. She took it gently, thanked him kindly, but her gaze never strayed from Caleb. Beneath the ranch eaves, Jemima stood beside her new husband, her hand woven with his. The wind cut cold, but his grasp held her warm. He bent and pressed a kiss to her brow. She closed her eyes, whispering, "This is the true beginning." Caleb tightened his hold, gray eyes softened. The beginning and forever. The spring that followed brought a change to Redemption Creek so deep that even its own people hardly believed it. For years, the shadow of widow auctions had hung like a stain. Men treated it as sport, spending coins to parade their power. Women, especially those left alone, became wares for laughter and barter. No one dared object. The custom had rooted itself too long. Yet after the botched arson and the trial that condemned Buck Watson, the town seemed shaken awake from a long slumber. The wedding of Jemima and Caleb planted a strange seed in every heart. They saw the widow who once stood veiled on an auction block now walking in white, her smile bright beneath church light. That image lingered. The old muttered, "Perhaps we have been wrong too long." The young no longer found courage to sneer. A gathering was called in the meeting hall, the very place where the gavel had once struck to begin each auction. Now a new sign hung upon the door, written carefully and tied with a white ribbon. Redemption Creek Women's Relief Fund. The gray-haired judge stepped to the front, eyes sweeping through the crowd. From this day, the auction of widows is ended forever. In its place, this town will keep a fund to aid women, those left without husbands, those raising children alone. No more shall we trade human lives like cattle. Instead, we will help them stand. For a breath, the room stayed silent. Then applause swelled, hesitant at first, then rolling like surf. Men who once slapped their knees in crude delight bowed their heads. Women in the front row gripped one another's hands, eyes bright with tears. Beside Caleb, Jemima's heart quivered. Memories of her own day on that wooden stage rushed back. The jeers, the laughter, the dry smell of straw. Yet this time the shame had become strength. She had lived long enough to watch the chain fall away. The fund soon took root. Neighbors gave coin, others gave labor. Widows no longer begged scraps at market, but learned trades, found work in shops, even claimed parcels of land to farm. Jemima was often present. She held no ledger, bore no title, yet she became the spirit of the place. For all wished to hear her story, the years spent hidden under a veil, the nights she sat with a knife against intruders, the moment she tore away the cloth and chose to live unveiled. In the small room she sat across from women hollowed by fear, her hand steadying theirs. Her voice was calm, without bitterness, simply the tone of one who had walked ahead. I know what it is to be turned into property. I know the weight of eyes that strip away dignity, but darkness does not last forever. It ends the moment we choose to stand. Once a young widow broke down before her. I'm so afraid. I couldn't bear being dragged out before them, like you were. Jemima's smile trembled, a tear shining. I was afraid that day too. But fear passed when I took the veil away, and I was not alone. Caleb was there. Maria was there. Others will stand with you too, if only you do not fall. Her words carried beyond the walls. People spoke Jemima's name now with respect, not rumor. One afternoon, Caleb rode to fetch her from the fund. As she stepped out, several men tipped their hats. A cluster of women came to clasp her hand, their smiles warm. Small gestures, but to Jemima they weighed more than gold. She climbed onto the horse behind Caleb, resting her hand lightly on his shoulder. Looking back, she saw the women waving farewell. Tears blurred her sight, yet this time they were born of joy. She was no longer alone. Caleb tilted his head, voice soft as the breeze. Are you well? She leaned against his back and whispered, I have never been so well. That spring in Redemption Creek, new shoots rose not only in the fields, but in the spirit of the town. And at its heart stood Jemima Jackson, the woman who once hid from the world beneath black cloth, now a symbol of pride and renewal. From commodity, she had become a flame to guide others, and by recognizing her, the town had in truth begun to redeem itself. Summer came, and Wyoming glowed in fresh green. At Double C Ranch, change showed in the smallest details. The rebuilt barn stood sturdier, the kitchen fire burned without fail, and along the fence by the entry lane, Jemima had begun quiet, steady work, planting red roses. The first day, when she held the small shoots in her hands, Caleb paused in surprise. "You want roses here?" he asked, uneasy, for the fence had always been nothing more than a place to hang bridles or for children to climb. Jemima smiled, warm as morning sun. "Roses on the fence will remind us that what once held us captive can still bloom." "It will stand for renewal," Caleb said nothing more, only bent to help her turn the soil. From that day on, each morning she tended the shoots, trimming leaves, watering, whispering to each bud, as though speaking to an old friend. In time, red blossoms broke open, brightening the path that led into the ranch. Double C Ranch was no longer marked only by hoofbeats and wind. It had become a home for many. Maria kept the kitchen alive. Pete lingered like a loyal younger brother, and a few widows with children sought shelter there, welcomed by Caleb and Jemima. Meals turned lively, the long table filled end to end. Children's laughter rose under the rafters, drowning the memory of fire and fear. Sometimes Jemima sat still and listened, her eyes shining not from sorrow, but from wonder. She had once believed her life was closed, and yet here it was, blooming. Roses on the fence, laughter in the house. One evening at sunset, she walked the fence row. The fading light touched her uncovered face, no longer veiled. Her hair was tied back, a few strands loose in the wind, her dark skin glowing gold. Roses reached out around her, as if to prove she had outlasted scorn and dread. From the porch, Caleb watched, pride filling his eyes. He did not need words, only to stand there and see the woman he loved live openly at last. Then a quiet joy came. One morning, Jemima took Caleb's hand and placed it upon her belly, her eyes shy yet shining. "Caleb, we are going to have a child." He froze, his calloused hand trembling as if reins had slipped. His heart thundered, years of solitude erased in an instant. He drew her close, whispering, "Thank you for giving me a new beginning." In her gaze there was no shadow now, only a tender flame. The roses flourished, a crimson blaze along the wooden fence. One dawn, the sun rose from the east, pouring light across the prairie. Jemima stood in the garden, her hand upon her belly, breathing the morning wind. Caleb came behind, wrapping her in his arms, resting his chin on her shoulder, his hands a vow that no power could part them. Before them stretched the ranch, horses galloping in the distance, children laughing in the yard. Behind them roses burned red as fire, and above the sky spread a canvas of rebirth. Jemima tilted her head, smiling. No veil, no fear, only a free woman, a home and a love strong enough to make roses bloom on fences once meant to hold her. Some stories pass like a stray wind, heard and forgotten. Others take root quietly, so that years later, sitting at dusk, we find ourselves stirred by them again. The journey of Jemima and Caleb in Redemption Creek is one such story. From a woman auctioned like stock, hidden behind black cloth, Jemima dared to step into the light. She no longer let fear or derision define her. And Caleb, once a man locked in silence, opened his heart, not just to guard, but to love fully. Two wounded lives found each other and began anew. The truest triumph was not in public victories or the downfall of an enemy. It was in the moment the town itself accepted her. when women waved farewell with smiles, when men tipped their hats in respect. That was proof enough that a community can change, can learn decency. Perhaps to those of you watching in later years, this story stirs something deep. For who among us has not borne loss, endured unfair judgment, or longed for a hand at the right moment? Jemima's tale reminds us it is never too late to be seen, to live true, and to find simple happiness. When she planted roses on the fence, she did more than adorn the ranch. She gave us a symbol. Where we were once bound, we can still bloom. And when she stood at dawn, carrying Caleb's child, we understood that love does more than redeem a soul. It can renew a whole small world. Friends, if one day you find yourself like Jemima, forced to cover pain behind a veil, would you dare to set it aside and choose to live openly? Share your thoughts below. If this story touched you, please leave a like, a subscription, and a comment, so we'll know this journey planted a seed in you too. And if you can, tell us, what was the fence that once held you, and what gave you back your freedom? Thank you for walking this road with us. May you always find a sunrise and a rose of your own in every season of life.